Now, I'm going to be talking about this particular area. I'm sure you have seen this map. This is the map of the United States, continental United States, showing where all coal is. And as you well know, that the energy content of the coals, anthracite has the most, and lignite has the least. And so we worked on this particular area here, and my remarks on reclamation are going to pertain to this area. I should tell you very quickly that if you were to draw a line from somewhere here, this is Lake Itasca, the source of Mississippi River, and if you were to draw a line from the source of Mississippi River down to the Gulf, you will be dividing the United States into two major parts. The eastern part of the United States along those lines has got far greater precipitation than evapotranspiration. In contrast, the part of the United States that is west of the Mississippi River has got far greater evapotranspiration than respiration, minus, of course, the very coastal fringe of Washington, Oregon, and California, but that's a very small strip. There was coal mining going on in a mine called Centralia in the Washington state. So, although we had an opportunity to work in the Adirondacks of New York, for those of you that may not know it, the Adirondacks of New York had iron mining going since 1790, so we did some work on that. And I and my students did work, of course, most recently in the mines of southeastern Ohio. But I'm going to be talking most of the time about western North Dakota and eastern Montana in this lecture, and move over this very, very fast. I'm sorry, I apologize. But before I do that, I want to tell you that this is what the grassland map of North America looks like. And what is remarkable about this is that although in ecological textbooks we always talk about biological diversity increasing as we go from a gradient of north to south, which is true, because there are higher temperatures and greater precipitation. I should tell you that if you were to go from east to west in North America, you will find a similar trend. There's a remarkable correlation between what you find in the east, the tall grass forest, as you come to the mixed grass forest, the short grass prairie, the desert grassland, similar things happen. And there is a remarkable correlation. Now, this is a slide I forbid my students to show, and I should forbid myself, but I put it for a reason. Disturbance. 99% of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, North Dakota, and Manitoba, all the grasslands have been converted. 99.9%. 99% for Minnesota, Missouri, and Nebraska, and 80 to 90% for Kansas, for South Dakota, for Texas, for Saskatchewan. And Alberta is somewhere here at about 61%. But these are the data of Sims and Paul Grisser, and they are excellent grassland workers. So add this also to the auditing of the disturbance. So I'm going to be talking about this particular area here, this Fort Union region, and this is very important. And again, I'm going to go pretty slowly. By the way, if you looked at the science from 3rd February this year, it says Saudi Arabia of the North, the new technologies of fracking and horizontal drilling are driving oil boom in North Dakota. It's exactly the same place where they are driving the boom for coal. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do is ask ourselves, well, what kind of a vegetation is there? What's it that we are dealing with in its native form? And North Dakota has the least forested cover in the United States, less than 1%. And it was strange that my first two doctoral students decided to work on the forests of North Dakota. I have a feeling that many of you might know, this used to be part of the Louisiana Purchase. It used to be under the French. And that's why we have the term prairie, which in French means grassland. And of course, they have also a term for these kinds of forests that are restricted to the courses of rivers. They call them gallery forests. And we did about 8 years of work. I don't believe in ecological research that is done over a year. I'm sorry, I apologize. But that's the way it is. No student worth his salt is going to publish anything after visiting an area for a year. That's strong guide. And so after 8 years of work, I used to tickle my students by telling them that never was so much written on so little by so many for the benefit of so few. And they really did not like that, I tell you. And of course, the reason that we have grasslands in grassland regions is because it's an inhospitable environment for the growth of trees. So therefore, all of these gallery forests are in depressions because wind takes a heavy toll on plant growth, and no self-respecting tree would grow in conditions like that. Quickly, this is what a drag line does when you mine coal. And this particular thing is a shovel. And some of these are so big that you can park 2 Cadillacs in it. Some of them are small. This is called Beulah Bell. It has a remarkable thing. It removes the earthen material and dumps it on the side like this. That's why you saw those undulating ridges and furrows, and I'm going to talk about that. And you get to the coal seam, and the reason people are going west is because in the eastern United States, any coal seam that is thicker than 10 inches is profitable to mine. But if you go to the west, you can have 100-foot thick coal seam, like here at the Powder River Basin of Wyoming. And this is how it's struck off. I tell all of my students, you know, that these things carry about 20 tons and have very poor brakes. And it is a lot of moisture content, and therefore you break it up on site and generate electric power right on site, and then you, of course, export the power. And here's what you get. These are abandoned mines. And what we did was, and here's a cross-section of the thing. These are Paleocene shales that have not seen the light of the day for the last 62 million years. And the moment they are brought to the surface, they break down very quickly into monochromatic clays, and these are somewhat difficult to revegetate. And this is a cross-section that showed that if you did a fossil pollen analysis, some of this vegetation that now is lignite was actually very similar to the Okefenokee swamps of southern Georgia today. So we came up with this ridiculous model. I don't want you to read it, although they used to pay me for giving an eye test to people. And, but here's what I would like to tell you very quickly. These are these abandoned spoils, and we wanted to study the vegetation that were on the crust, on the slope, and the lower slope. We also wanted to look at each of these compass directions: south, southeast, southwest, east, west, northeast, northwest, because in North America, the one largest important ecological factor is topography. And this particular illustration shows you the sunlight. It strikes most of the southern slopes, and because the solar energy is much greater there, therefore there are water problems. There's quick evaporation and evapotranspiration, in contrast to the northern slopes that are cooler and therefore have better water conditions. And if you were to press this, you come up with this target diagram, crust in the middle, upper slope, and we did some crazy things, and you don't have to do that kind of thing. It's silly. So one of the first plants that we saw coming in was a kinopod by the name of Coccus coparia. Those of you, again, if there are pure botanists here. And we studied every darn thing that there was possible. You know, we looked at the vegetation. We had microclimatic stations, and we were getting all kinds of readings. And we looked at the soils as a chrono sequence. We looked at the chemical properties, every bloody property that you could measure and think of. And then we, of course, built simulation models on climate plants and spoils using century models. And we also had an immense number of growth chamber experiments that related to the physiology of the species, and on and on and on. And here's what we got. And by the way, this is published, so if anybody would like a copy of the reprint, I shall be pleased. It was published in 1999. And we actually saw that, that there were some species that would come in for the first 5 or 6 years, others that would last for another 15 or so. Others would kind of not come on the disturbed sites. And this particular species is little blue stem for the botanists and ecologists in the room, and it's too self-respecting to throw its roots in disturbed systems at all. And strangely enough, the Montana Department of Environmental Conservation had listed little blue stem as the species that should be grown. And for some strange reason, they never asked big blue stem if it wanted to grow there. And our work has been dominantly on carbon and nitrogen dynamics for 2 reasons. Both carbon and nitrogen are not only indicators of soil fertility, they are also indicators of soil productivity. And for a long, long time, we were looking at carbon and nitrogen values. And again, to point out, here are the southern slopes with the least nitrogen mineralization, and here are the northern slopes and northwestern slopes. Again, this is published work. If any of you should wish a copy. We also wanted to see, one of our aims was to see what Mother Nature is doing and what we can do about it. And so, can we gain on time so that we can then make a strong case for strong legislation? So again, I will be pleased to send this. So we looked at some trends. We looked at how the pioneering species were behaving. We looked at the successional patterns. We were looking at what was happening to dominant ions and trace elements and carbon-nitrogen ratios. And we got an idea that roughly it would take about 150 years for these areas to get revegetated on northern slopes, and pretty close to about 200 on southern slopes. So we had a whole bunch of experimental sites in western North Dakota, and we had some good success. And in each case, we always grew grasses and legumes together. And again, there are a lot of papers on these that I'll be pleased to say. Now, by 1975, we took a crack at can we have laws? And one of the remarkable things was that we had an extremely well-meaning governor. He was a farmer, but I have never seen people with such tremendous sense of the earth as he, and as bright as he was. The name was the late Governor Arthur Lake. He was a dear personal friend, and he wanted to know how we can put things back. So we decided that we are going to have companies prepare a mining plan and get it approved by the Public Service Commission, which has the authority to look at these mines. We said that they are going to remove the topsoil. We said that as dragline moves, we didn't want them to stockpile because the deeper layers of the stockpiles get anaerobic and they are worthless. And then replace the B horizon first and A next, apply appropriate fertilizer and use seed mixture. And one of the guys who was not only a brilliant environmental lawyer was Robert Beck, and his paper again is published in a book that I edited, and he has not only been a dear friend but a mentor, and so we were already there. I want to draw your attention to some words. North Dakota Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Law of '73. In 1977, the United States government passed a federal law after Jerry Ford vetoed it twice in his presidency. President Jimmy Carter signed it on August 3rd, 1977. And the name of that law, as I'm going to show you in a moment, is Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. It's the same thing. So, we had an interesting thing happen. After we did all of this TLC, we thought, eureka, the problem is done. Guess what? No. The first species that came in was Kochia scoparia, the same plant that grows small, stunted, all by itself. And I'm going to tell this story to the students on Thursday and show you the mechanisms on what happened. But one of the wonderful things was that in 4 years, it was gone. So from that, we drew some conclusions about what I call secondary succession, because when you put topsoil on things, you are actually mimicking areas like those that are abandoned agricultural areas, so that you give them some organic matter, or as ecologists like to complicate the words, it has some biological legacy. Primary succession does not have any organic matter. So, again, we looked at a whole bunch of things, and I shall concentrate on this on Thursday, but right now I must move on. And what do animals eat in the area? It was really interesting. One of the students came to me, and he was interested in studying bighorn sheep. I said, Steve, I can't advise anybody. I'm not an animal ecologist. He said, either I do my degree with you or I don't do it at all. I've seen some persistent kids, but this kid was persistent. So what we decided was he was going to do 75% of the thesis that lay in my domain, and we would get committee members that would advise him on others. This is the king of the prairies, no more now. But this is what Steve was interested in, the bighorn sheep. And our governor, in his infinite wisdom, decided that he would allow harvesting of 12 sheep each in 2 years. And Steve Farisal was with a bucket going around with the hunters, collecting every conceivable tissue of bighorn sheep, from antlers to hoofs to liver to whatever. We also sent about 1,000 samples of the stomach and rumen content of these bighorn sheep to Colorado State University's animal laboratory, so that they're able to identify the plant species back to their origin, which was fantastic, because we wanted to know what is it that these species like to eat, then we can include them in the mix. And turned out, again, they love Eurosia lanata, Ceratoides lanata in the old literature, again a kinopod. And can you believe that animals are very discriminate in what they eat? They are not like humans that eat everything in a paper bag, in a plastic bag, in Gino's pizza, or whatever else. So 80%, 85% of the diet of bighorn sheep was this plant. And that's why Steve found very few plants there. Okay, so the federal law that was passed, about which I mentioned, we had a little bit of a hand in it. And if somebody asks a question, I can say something more about it. But we wanted to make sure that we wanted to talk about self-regeneration of species that they put in these sites, plant succession. We wanted to talk about ground cover and productivity. And we wanted to talk about species diversity, seasonal variety, and regenerative capacity. These were some key words. And despite the fact that these rule-making on this law, which was about 50 to 100 pages when it was passed, after rule-making and lawyers got into the act, it now is in 3 volumes, several thousand pages, 3 columns, and about 6-point print. God bless us. And so the more garbage you put in, the more difficult it is to govern, which is the idea. But again, the federal law also included all of those steps that North Dakota has, and something more. They actually made it very solid. Now, the federal legislation requires, these are the minimum standards. The states could make them more strict, which North Dakota and Montana did. But these are the minimum standards to which the federal government, the Office of Surface Mining, which was created under SMECRA of 1977, had to uphold. Okay, so we tried to give recipes for post-disturbance land use. If you want agriculture, if you want pasture, if you want just a forest cover, a wildlife habitat, urban industrial aesthetic. But one of the things that we built in our recommendation was what should be the performance standards. And we said We don't care how much topsoil they put on. We must hold operators responsible for reclamation. Is it important today, what we did in 70s and 80s and 90s? The answer, gentlemen and ladies, is yes. Because if you look at this particular news item from BBC just last week, the coal mining is going to be increasing tremendously. There are going to be more and more areas that are going to be mined. And if you look at this, this is India and China and all the developing countries. And in fact, says this report from BBC, coal was the fastest growing form of energy in the world. Last year with production up 6% on 2010, which was twice the rate of increase over gas and times 4, greater than 4 for oil. So there's going to be lots of land for reclamation. And Ann is smiling, I can tell. So, first land degradation, then reclamation laws, and some successful reclamation. So we should go home, no problem. Except things aren't so simple. Because now, what we have is this. Global warming. Why is it important? Because it's going to change the phenology of the species. Phenology is defined as the time that seasonality that species follow in case of plants from seed to senescence to death. And this whole thing is going to change. But it's also changing for pests. The pine beetles, the spruce budworm. And there are a tremendous number of examples that have already been documented from Alaska, from British Columbia, from Colorado. And the disease, this has a direct impact on human health. So, here is the same. Our carbon dioxide concentration is increasing. In October 2012, it was at 391 ppm. The World Meteorological Organization, which supports climate change research to a great degree, says that the greenhouse gases hit an all-time high in 2011. I should warn you that this number of 391.01 is going to be lower when you see the results for the entire 12 months, because September and October numbers are generally low, and I have seen the actual data. So what we did was, for the last 10 years or so, the most recent 10 years, was that we started looking at what it would do. If there was a 1 degree temperature increase, what would it do to the ecosystems? So we worked in Ohio on the forest ecosystems, on urban systems, on surface mine systems, and on cropland systems. And I have described this in a paper that was published in the UNESCO journal, Nature and Resources, and it's called Assessing Terrestrial Ecosystem Sustainability, the Usefulness of Regional Carbon and Nitrogen Models. And I had a brilliant group of students. This particular gentleman here is Chris West. He got his bachelor's from the University of Kentucky, did his master's and PhD with me. After being a scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, he has now gone over to the Pacific Northwest National Lab, a branch of which is located on the campus of the University of Maryland. He worked on strip mine sites in southeastern Ohio. This is Devi Kapant, my only Indian student. She worked on urban ecosystems, and we found out that Cuyahoga County, that has got Cleveland, had the best data set of our own county, Franklin, on urban forests, and so she did a fantastic job on modeling what would happen to urban trees. This is Fateh Evren Daylak. He came to me. He was sponsored by the government of Turkey, for he was one of the top 10 students. He got his master's from the University of Delaware in environmental policy, and he did a PhD with me, and he actually looked at the 130-year history of wheat and corn growth, and then started looking at what would converted all of it into carbon and nitrogen and tried to see what would happen. He is back in Turkey. He is now a full professor of environmental science in the Faculty of Environmental Engineering. This is Steve Watts. He got his bachelor's from Utah State and master's from Texas A&M, and both Tris and Steve were Department of Defense fellows. Funding that I got and was good lucrative fellowships. Steve is now in charge of ecosystem restoration or bioremediation at Edwards Air Force Base in California, doing restoration work. And then there's Holly Gibbs. She got bachelor's in honors and master's with me. And I am allergic to any student getting 3 degrees from the same university, so I told her before she completed her thesis that perhaps it would be better to go somewhere else. And while she was taking my restoration course, she was tremendously fascinated by the work of Raman Kuti and Jonathan Foley, and strangely enough, that's who she did a PhD with. She spent 3 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford and is now a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And the last guy in this group was Jason Funk. He too got his bachelor's with honors and master's with me, and he too had to be gently told to go somewhere else, which he did. And he has got his PhD from Stanford with Chris Field and Pamela Madsen. Now, what did all these guys tell us about the ecosystems? There was one overriding conclusion. As temperatures rise, for example, in temperate ecosystems like Ohio, agricultural, forests, disturbed sites, and urban, the soils will become increasingly a source rather than a sink. So there are going to be problems even for Ohio. That's very good from the point of view of how much precipitation we get. And a former student of mine who did his PhD on reclamation is now a senior scientist with the U.S. Forest Service, and he now leads a group in the United States Forest Service on what will happen to the trees. And here is what he finds. This is the current, this is forest inventory assessment. And very diverse communities. And he finds that if once he subjected it to a Hadley modeling techniques, Hadley produces fantastic, this is the Hadley Met office in UK that produces these global circulation models. And they use their models and find out that what's going to happen is that this whole vegetation is going to get homogenized. They also ran several simulations with the Canadian Climate Center, which is located at the University of Victoria, and the same kind of a thing. The diversity was being lost, and there was more and more dominance by 1 or 2 species. So this should be of concern. Okay, so this phenology thing, this change of timing because of high temperatures, is going to affect populations and communities and ecosystems. And there's going to be a paper coming out very soon. Right now, it is in the process of printing in the Journal of Animal Ecology, published by the British Ecological Society, by Melazzo et al. It was accepted in the latest issue of Science last Friday. As species individually begin to respond to their changing environments, unexpected interactions and impacts among species are likely to occur. And so, as the climate changes, we should start to expect the unexpected. And those of you that are interested, keep an eye on this paper. It will be in the latest issue of the Journal of Animal Ecology. Now, and somebody, of course, wants to tell you, and this is a published paper, that phenology is not only going to change merely the timing, but it's going to change the whole thing. Flowering, community structure, rain shifts, weather, you name it. This particular paper by Morset et al. Is in the Frontiers of Ecology and Environment. One of the big questions that we don't know anything about is precipitation. how's rainfall going to be affected? Because normally, carbon dioxide is a limiting factor for photosynthesis naturally. And this is why we made some early mistakes in trying to be jubilant about the fact that the limiting factor of CO2 would be taken out. My good friend Boyd Strain from Duke did a large number of experiments in the Duke Phytotron to tell us that. But it turns out that it's not just a physiological experiment, it's an ecological experiment. We've got to find out what's going to happen with precipitation, and that's very important. And if you look at this, this is the US Drought Monitor, and this is the latest animation from them. This is what happened to the United States this year. The biggest drought time ever recorded. And this is the latest from the US Drought Monitor. And just last week, last Saturday, the World Bank issued this report, Turn Down the Heat, why a 4-degree warmer climate must be awaited. The World Bank. All nations will suffer the effects of a warmer world, but the world's poorest countries will suffer the most because of food shortages, rising sea levels, cyclones, and drought. That's what this report says. I am told that it's not on the market yet, but I think it should be in the next week or 10 days, or maybe it already is out. So, we have to make disturbed lands biologically productive again, and that is why reclamation has global importance. So, whether you are from the east or the west, welcome to the biosphere. And I thank you so much for having me here. And thank you for being such a patient audience.